So let's go on to a broader discussion of loop etiquette. So when we have a loop, we want to make clear what we're iterating over. We typically label these so-called variables, these iteration variables, according to the type of thing being iterated over. Well, in this case, we've named it I, which is a sort of time-honored name for, N, time-honored things, name for sort of a count of things. And a better name here would actually be I, because I is typically an index. It's an index into something. In this case, it's an index into and around. So this actually would have been better named with I there, rather than N. N is commonly denoting sort of a count of things, but it's not terrible. N normally denotes does denote an integer, okay? Sometimes we'll want to label that with like, if we're iterating over students in a class, we'll want to say I person to indicate, or I student to indicate that it's, we're iterating over students. Another very important issue is you need to avoid overly deep loops. So if you have loops that are nested within one another, it can get really confusing. What can be confusing? Well, if you have break commands or continue commands, can anyone tell me how break works? When I say break, in the context of a loop, what does that mean? Yeah. So I'm going to leave that loop, get out of it. How about continue? Yeah, it now we'll go immediately on to the next iteration rather than continuing on this flow for this iteration. So the issue is that continue, which you want to know easily with respect to which loop you're breaking or continuing, which is the one you're breaking out of, which is the one you're continuing on. And if you have several loops nested, that can be unclear. It requires you to sort of go and go up and check what's the innermost loop right now, and it's just asking again for confusion. So one of the things I'd suggest that you do is if you have a loop, which inside it has some substantive work to be done, you think about making it a call to a method or a function. You call off to some function which does the body within each iteration of the loop. After all, each iteration of that loop is probably accomplishing something meaningful. It's doing something. And you might really just want to carve it off, name it as a function. You can call it from different places, because chances are it may be something you need from in other areas of the program. And it makes the loop much easier to read. Particularly that thing we call hoisting what was an inner loop into a function instead. And if you want to see all that detail, you can go to the function, but otherwise you see a nice brief description in the function name of what's going on there, okay? Okay, we talked about indentation, and I should note that indentation is tied up with issues of brace style. This is a thing of particular stylistic conviction within the C context. When I'm talking about braces, what am I talking about here? Curly braces, the sort of thing that begins a block of code and that ends a block of code. And there's different conventions you'll see with respect to the placement of braces. Can anyone tell me some of the issues that come in when you have braces used in the context of a loop or an if statement? What are some of the choices that need to be made? Exactly. So one issue is if you have something like, is student, and it's a large brace. But if the question is, do you want that brace on the same line as this, or do you in fact put this further up and the brace follows it in the next line? Another issue is this brace invented at the same level as the code within it, or instead is it indented, is it handled so that the code inside of it is sort of indented further, and you have something like this. So if his student, excuse me, and you have a brace here and a brace here, and then the code in here starts with one extra indentation. People care about these things within teams. They like people to be consistent in where they put their braces, and they feel strongly about these sometimes. If you're in a team, when in Rome, do as the Romans do in terms of this aspect. And here, try to figure out for your team members what convention existing convention they're using or work out one, because it really helps to be able to glance at something and see what's on there. For example, to be able to glance at a for statement and see immediately if there's a brace following it, to look at the next line rather than the same one. Okay, so seems like a minor point, but people care about these things in practice because it makes the code easier to read. It's not that one of these is particularly privileged, it's just that there's camps that hew very, very strongly to one particular style. So for example, those where it's placed in the same line, they're sometimes called K&R style, Kernighan and Ritchie, the inventors of C. You'll find variations of that style, which I've heard called ear style. So when you have an else, you have two brackets, like ears on either side of the else. And people commonly make use of that style if they put a bracket after the if. Just adhere to a clear convention. Don't write some code which is one, some code which is the other, to be looked at by the same people. Okay. Okay. So here's an example. So how could I improve this code? Yeah, that'd be nice. How about another way? Again, naming but not variables has to do with name of the function.
Yeah, like what is PS?
Yeah. that term has, yes, that acronym has many and diverse meanings. It reminds me of the student team for 371 that was called their system real-time pizza ordering system, and the annotation, the acronym for it was RTPOS. And I think, given the quality of that system, there was a deliberate pun involved. So BS could be further explicated. What's another issue? Yeah, so there's sort of whacked out indentation going on here. You have inconsistent indentation, to say the least. So here you have, for example, an else if and then an indentation there, but these two ifs have no indentation beneath them. You have this sort of if, which is indented relative to the variable declaration before it, which is odd, very odd. And generally it's kind of hard to see the logical structure associated with it. Now, you may think this is totally obvious, but one thing you gotta be aware of, and it's one of those niggly little things that is troubling, that if you kind of screw up on it, you can get yourself in trouble, is that some of these, what seems like whacked out indentation can merely be the result of a situation where you have an intermixing of tabs and spaces in your program. Those are displayed using different conventions and different systems, and what may lead on another person's system, the return to be further indented relative to if on your system may lead to this. So if you're going to be doing indentation, use tabs, okay? You could alternatively use spaces consistently if you so wish, but it's easier to use tabs. Just be aware that you can screw this up. So a cleaner example of this code, sort of thing I'd like to see from your code, would be going from something like this to something like this. Is that clear? Now we know what BS is, okay, it's a binary search. That thing that was, that list of parameters earlier, the list of arguments here, V, A, and N, are now value, array, and array size, okay? Now we have clear indenting conventions, and the structure of it is just a lot code. We have a comment which makes clear the function of this final else, and dealing with the case where the thing in the midpoint of the array is exactly the value that we're seeking. This is about the right size of functions, well named, that they're looking for, and that people look for, typically 10 lines or fewer, and has fairly descriptive names associated with its variables. People comfortable with the idea that this is just a world apart from this in terms of clarity. You could spend a couple minutes trying to figuring out what this does. Here you know what it is. If you've heard of a binary search before, you say, okay, so it's accomplishing a binary search. You don't know what it is, you can look it up immediately, instead of looking up online BS. Okay, so here we see a little example where indentation can go a long way, as well as good variable